I am going to trace how an honored defender of Shurima became the Darkin Blade, how an ordinary Rakaran named Atreus became the new Pantheon, and why their rivalry is really a struggle between despair and the stubborn will to keep going. To understand that struggle, I need to clear up one name at the very beginning. Pantheon is not simply one person. For part of this story, Pantheon is a celestial aspect, an immortal idea of war that takes control of a mortal body. Later, Pantheon becomes the name chosen by Atreus, the man whose body had been taken. Those two versions of Pantheon share a body, a spear, a shield, and a constellation, but they do not share the same view of humanity. That difference sits at the heart of everything that follows. The celestial Pantheon sees mortal weakness as a flaw to overcome, while Atreus eventually comes to see mortality itself as the source of human courage. A god can fight with the assurance of divine power. A mortal fights while knowing that strength may fail, that time is limited, and that every victory can still carry a cost. Aatrox stands at the other end of this conflict. He once served an empire and defended the world against the void, yet the ages stripped away the meaning he once found in duty. Imprisonment left him trapped within his own weapon, separated from the form and freedom he remembered. When he returned to the world, he did not return as its protector. He returned convinced that destruction offered the only answer to his endless confinement. Their rivalry is often reduced to a simple question about strength. People ask whether Aatrox defeated Pantheon, whether Atreus truly defeated Aatrox, or which one would win if they fought again. Those questions matter, but they do not explain why this confrontation has become one of the most meaningful rivalries in Runeterra. The deeper answer begins with what each warrior believes. Aatrox believes that suffering eventually empties every ideal of meaning. Atreus believes that meaning can be rebuilt each time a person rises. Aatrox points to the ruins of history and sees proof that hope is a lie. Atreus looks at those same ruins and sees people who still need someone to stand beside them. Neither warrior begins in the place where we meet him today. Aatrox did not begin as a destroyer, and Atreus did not begin as a hero capable of carrying celestial weapons. One fell from a height almost beyond mortal understanding. The other started from the ground and became known mainly for getting back onto his feet. That contrast gives their story its shape. Aatrox possesses the memory of greatness and cannot accept what he has become. Atreus spends much of his life being told he is not great, only to discover that his limitations never prevented him from choosing what kind of man he would be. Before their paths meet, one story travels upward toward the summit of Mount Targon, while the other descends from the golden age of Shurima into war, bitterness, and captivity. Their meeting brings those two movements together. The fallen god warrior encounters the man who climbed toward divinity, and both discover that the result is nothing like either expected. I will begin with Atreus, because the mortal at the center of this rivalry is easy to overlook. Aatrox looks like the obvious force of the story, and the celestial Pantheon carries a title known across Targon. Atreus begins with no such advantage. His importance comes from persistence, not prophecy. I will begin with Atreus among the Rakor, before a god ever took his name. Atreus was born on the hostile slopes of Mount Targon among the Rakor, a people shaped by the mountain and by a culture that honored martial discipline. He received his name from a star in the constellation of War, the same constellation known as the Pantheon. The name linked him to something vast, but the boy himself did not appear destined to match it. From an early age, Atreus expected battle to define his life. He trained to join the Rahorak, the militant order of the Rakor, and he committed himself to the work with an intensity that never depended on natural brilliance. He did not become the strongest recruit, and he did not become the most skilled. What distinguished him appeared only after he lost. Atreus stood back up. Training exposed the difference between talent and endurance. Other warriors could strike faster, move more cleanly, or learn a technique with less effort, while Atreus often found himself driven onto the stones. Each fall could have confirmed what everyone already seemed to know, that he lacked the gifts expected of a great warrior. Instead, every fall became another chance to rise. That habit created a rivalry with another recruit named Pylus. Where Atreus struggled, Pylus carried skill and strength more naturally, and the two young men met again and again in the training circle. Atreus could not reliably overcome him, yet Pylus could not make him stay down. Rivalry slowly became respect. Pylus began to understand that Atreus's refusal was not empty stubbornness, and Atreus recognized the quality of the warrior across from him. Shared hardship did what easy friendship might not have done, turning competition into a brotherhood strong enough to shape both their futures. I think this part of Atreus's life matters, because the story never secretly reveals that he had been the greatest warrior all along. His later power does not rewrite his early limitations. Atreus truly struggled, he truly lost, and he truly needed more effort than people around him. That makes his endurance different from the confidence of someone who always expects to win. Atreus learned to continue without that assurance. Long before he faced a Darkin, he practiced the one response Aatrox would never understand. Defeat could be real without being final. The bond between Atreus and Pylus deepened when they encountered danger beyond the training ground. Their Racor patrol came across a barbarian incursion, and the ambush destroyed the rest of the patrol. Atreus and Pylus survived, but survival did not feel like victory when their companions had fallen and the threat remained. The two warriors wanted a decisive answer. When the aspect of the sun refused to destroy the trespassers, Atreus and Pylus decided that they would seek divine power for themselves. They would climb Mount Targon, reach its summit, and claim the strength they believed their people needed. This decision grew from understandable anger, but it also exposed a flaw in Atreus's thinking. At that point in his life, he still looked upward for the power to solve mortal problems. The people around him seemed too vulnerable, established authority seemed too cautious, and the stars promised a strength far beyond anything a Racor warrior could earn in the training circle. Mount Targon makes such promises without offering guarantees. Its peak rises beyond ordinary terrain and touches forces linked to the celestial realm. Those who climb do not simply complete a difficult journey. They enter a trial capable of changing identity, purpose, and fate. Atreus and Pylus began the ascent together. Every part of their friendship led toward that climb, because neither man approached the mountain only for himself. They wanted power that could protect their people, and each believed the other would stand beside him at the summit. The mountain did not honor that expectation. The climb lasted long enough to strip away the confidence with which they began, and Pylus reached the limit of what his body could endure. Near the summit, after proving himself the more naturally gifted warrior for so much of their youth, Pylus could go no farther. He died on the mountain. Atreus continued alone, carrying both the purpose of the climb and the grief of losing the person who had made the journey with him. Reaching the summit should have marked his greatest triumph, yet the victory had already taken the shape of loss. The power he sought would arrive, but it would not restore Pylus or return Atreus to the life he had known. The skies opened, and Atreus became host to the aspect of war. At the summit, the story changes from a climb toward power into the loss of a man's control. Ascension on Mount Targon does not follow a single pattern. Some mortals become vessels who retain a recognizable will and identity, while other relationships between an aspect and a host appear more complicated. In Atreus's case, the divine Pantheon judged the mortal who reached the summit and found him unworthy. The judgment reveals how the aspect understood strength. Atreus had known defeat throughout his life. He had reached the summit only after losing his closest friend, and nothing about his record resembled the effortless perfection a god of war might admire. Pantheon did not see endurance as greatness. It saw a mortal who failed. Instead of sharing power with Atreus, the aspect took control of his body. The man who had climbed the mountain found himself pushed into a distant corner of his own mind, while a celestial intelligence wore his form, carried its weapons, and pursued goals it considered too important for mortals. This was not the reward Atreus had imagined. He sought strength so he could make choices that protected the Rakor, yet the power at the summit removed his ability to choose at all. His body returned from Targon, but the will directing it belonged to the aspect. Pantheon carried a celestial spear and shield, weapons tied to the constellation of war. To those who saw the divine warrior, Atreus may have appeared transformed into the champion he had always wanted to become. Inside that body, the real Atreus could do little more than endure scattered impressions of what the aspect did. Once again, endurance became his only possession. He could not overpower the being that had taken control, and he could not return to the ordinary life below the summit. Pantheon treated him as a failed vessel, useful because a celestial force required a mortal form in Runeterra. The irony is severe. Atreus climbed because he believed ordinary people needed divine power, and the divine power immediately dismissed the value of an ordinary person. The aspect considered the human mind an obstacle, not a partner. Its idea of war left no room for the man who had survived enough defeats to reach it. From within, Atreus received only vague visions while Pantheon searched the world for the Darkin. These living weapons came from an earlier age, and they represented enemies with roots far older than the mortal conflict that had driven Atreus up the mountain. Among them stood Aatrox. To Pantheon, Aatrox was an ancient threat that demanded celestial intervention. Their confrontation belonged to a history of aspects, ascended beings, and powers capable of shaping nations. The armies of ordinary people caught beneath them appeared secondary to the main battle. Atreus could not accept that view once he returned to himself. Later, he would come to understand that the people beneath these great powers were never secondary. They were the reason power needed to be opposed. Before that awakening could happen, Pantheon had to meet a warrior with enough force to accomplish what mortals would have called impossible. Aatrox did not merely defeat the aspect's host. His weapon destroyed the celestial power within Atreus and erased the constellation of war from the sky. To understand how Aatrox could stand against an aspect, I need to move away from Targon and return to the ancient empire of Shurima. His story begins long before Atreus, before the Rakor's immediate conflict, and before the name Darkin carried its present terror. To understand the enemy that Pantheon sought, I need to return to Aatrox before his fall. Whether later generations remembered Aatrox as a demon or a god depended on the story that reached them. Both descriptions hid the truth that he had once been an honored defender of Shurima. He belonged to the Ascended, the mighty god warriors created through the Empire's sacred power. The Ascended were not born as monsters. Shurima raised mortals into new forms through the power of the sun disk, granting selected individuals bodies and abilities far beyond ordinary human limits. They became symbols of the Empire, military leaders, protectors, and living proof of Shurima's connection to celestial power. Aatrox stood among those champions. Official accounts describe him as noble and honored, a warrior who inspired others and whose conduct helped unify the god warriors who served beside him. This earlier identity is important because his later hatred did not grow from a life that had always been empty. He had known belonging. He had known purpose. Those memories made his fall more painful, not less. A being who never understood honor could dismiss it easily, while Aatrox carried an awareness of what he and his brethren had once represented. Every later corruption of his form reminded him that he had once stood as something admired. Shurima eventually faced a danger that threatened far more than one empire. In Acacia, rebellion opened the way for the Void, an alien force whose presence violated the order of the world. The Ascended marched against it because the conflict demanded powers ordinary armies could not match. Aatrox and his brethren fought as defenders of Runeterra. Their strength helped turn back the threat, but victory offered no clean restoration. Exposure to that war left lasting damage on the survivors, and the God Warriors returned carrying wounds of mind and spirit that their immense bodies could not make visible or simple. The Void War placed Aatrox's story beside Atreus's in an unexpected way. Both men faced an enemy greater than themselves, and both endured the loss of people and purpose. Yet their responses separated over time. Atreus learned to treat pain as a reason to protect others, while Aatrox slowly allowed pain to become proof that protection had never mattered. That change did not happen in one moment. The Ascended still belonged to Shurima when they returned, and an empire still existed to give their strength direction. Aatrox could see himself as a guardian because there remained something recognizable to guard. The collapse of Shurima removed that center. Emperor Azir's failed ascension, and the betrayal surrounding it shattered the empire, leaving the surviving God Warriors without the authority and structure that had held them together. The sun disk fell, cities broke away, and old unity gave way to competing claims. For beings of enormous power, the loss of a shared purpose carried consequences across entire regions. The Ascended had led armies and shaped the empire for ages, but now no emperor stood above them. Their loyalty could no longer point toward one future. Some tried to preserve order. Others gathered followers and territory. Rivalries sharpened, old wounds returned, and the warriors who had once defended the world began fighting over its remains. Mortals came to call them Darkin. The word marked a transformation in how the survivors of Shurima were seen, but it also reflected what many of the God Warriors had become. They turned to blood magic, altering bodies and building new forms through a power that answered pain with control. Instead of restoring their old nobility, each attempt to master their condition pulled them farther from it. Aatrox emerged as a leader among the Darkin. The same qualities that once helped him unite Shurima's defenders could now gather armies around a darker purpose. His greatness had not vanished. It had been twisted, and that made him more dangerous than a creature guided by instinct alone. He remembered strategy, command, and the discipline of an ascended warrior. He also carried bitterness toward the celestial order connected to Shurima's power. Aatrox had served, suffered, and watched the empire collapse, while the distant forces above appeared untouched by the cost. The Darkin Wars spread devastation through the world left behind by Shurima. God warriors fought one another, mortal armies became extensions of their rivalries, and regions already struggling after the Empire's fall faced powers they could barely resist. This age eventually drew Targon's response. The aspect of Twilight provided mortals with the knowledge needed to trap the Darkin within their own weapons. It was a form of victory based on cunning and celestial magic, rather than a direct contest of strength. Aatrox was bound within his sword. The imprisonment did not grant him ordinary sleep or the passage of time as a free being. His consciousness remained confined, unable to move through the world in the form he remembered. The honored Ascended, the commander, and the Darkin leader all became reduced to a presence inside a weapon that others could hide. Centuries passed. That single fact explains more about Aatrox than a list of battles ever could. His confinement denied motion, sensation, command, and the simple confirmation that a body still belonged to him. Time did not heal his anger, because time itself became part of the punishment. The trap also forced Aatrox into a relationship with mortality that inverted the one Atreus would later embrace. Atreus finds meaning in the limits of a mortal body. Aatrox experiences bodies as temporary material, shapes he must claim because his true form remains inaccessible. When someone finally took up the sword, Aatrox discovered a path back into the world. He overwhelmed the wielder and transformed the stolen body through blood magic, constructing an imitation of his former ascended appearance. That form could move, fight, and command fear, but it could not truly restore what the prison had taken. Every return carried instability. Aatrox needed new flesh to maintain a body, and the result remained an approximation of the god warrior he remembered. The more he tried to rebuild his old shape, the more clearly the effort exposed that the original was gone. Freedom became another kind of reminder. Aatrox's rage expanded beyond the mortals who carried his weapon. He hated the celestial powers connected to his imprisonment, the world that continued while he remained trapped, and the structure of existence that allowed him to be confined without release. Vengeance alone could not satisfy that hatred, because no victory could return the lost ages. His goal grew toward destruction on a world-ending scale. Aatrox came to believe that if he dragged all creation into ruin, the prison and the consciousness bound within it might finally be undone as well. The protector who once stood against the void now threatened the world he had helped preserve. This aim makes him more than a conqueror. A conqueror expects to rule what remains, but Aatrox's despair leaves no meaningful future to rule. He does not offer people a harsh new order. He attempts to prove that every order, every promise, and every act of resistance will eventually collapse. That is why hope itself becomes his enemy. A surviving person can rebuild. A community can remember kindness after violence. A defeated warrior can stand again. Each of those acts contradicts the conclusion Aatrox has drawn from his own history. He cannot tolerate that contradiction for long. If Atreus can suffer, lose divine power, and still choose to protect strangers, then Aatrox's despair is not an unavoidable truth. It is a choice, even if it is a choice shaped by pain beyond ordinary experience. Their conflict had not yet reached that philosophical clarity when Aatrox approached Targon. At first, the meeting appeared to be exactly what both ancient powers expected. A Darkin faced the aspect of war, and ordinary mortals could do little but endure the consequences. Their separate histories finally meet in the first clash between Aatrox and the aspect of war. Aatrox sought the peak of Mount Targon, placing him on a path toward the celestial forces he despised. The aspect of war, using Atreus's body, confronted him not far from the mountain. Beneath them stood armies of men. Yet the central combat quickly rose beyond anything those armies could control. Pantheon and Aatrox fought with the strength of beings shaped by ancient magic. Their battle moved into the skies and swept through the conflict below. From the distant corner of his own mind, Atreus could not direct the body that carried him through it. The divine Pantheon likely saw this as the kind of task for which it had taken control. Here stood a Darkin, an enemy whose power seemed to justify the aspect's belief that mortal will was insufficient. Atreus had been judged unworthy, and the god of war had taken his place to face a threat only divinity could meet. Aatrox overturned that certainty. His sword struck through the aspect's defense and entered the chest of its mortal host. The blow destroyed the celestial Pantheon and removed the constellation of war from the heavens. War itself appeared to vanish. The victory proved Aatrox's ability to destroy a celestial being, but the sword passed through a body that still belonged to Atreus. The aspect died. The mortal remained. Atreus awakened inside the body Pantheon had treated as a shell. He returned at the worst possible moment, gravely wounded, holding weapons whose celestial light had faded, and facing the Darkin who had just accomplished the impossible. Nothing about the scene suggested hope. Atreus possessed no divine voice to guide him, no friend beside him, and no clear reason for Aatrox to regard him as a threat. The god had fallen, leaving behind the man it had dismissed. Atreus answered with defiance. He remained conscious, refused to offer Aatrox submission, and showed that the body still contained a will the aspect had never understood. Aatrox mocked him and departed, expecting the injury to finish what the battle had begun. Hours passed before Atreus stood. That period repeats the pattern of his entire life on a scale no training circle could have prepared him for. He had been struck down in a clash between powers far beyond him, and no one would have blamed an ordinary man for failing to rise. Atreus rose anyway. The act did not restore the aspect. It did not immediately relight the spear or return the constellation. Atreus first stood as himself, relying on the same persistence he had shown before Targon ever gave him power. He made his way back toward the Rakor, and the journey demonstrated something the aspect had missed. Atreus's strength had never depended on winning cleanly. It appeared in the space after defeat, when pain remained real and the choice to continue still had to be made. Atreus's return to mortal life begins with Iula and the quiet work of recovery. Atreus recovered at the homestead once shared by Pylus and Iula. Pylus had not returned from Mount Targon, leaving Iula to live with the cost of a climb that promised divine answers and delivered grief. She nevertheless helped the surviving man, who came back carrying the weapons of the power that had taken him away. Recovery lasted for months. Atreus could not simply rise from the first battle and challenge Aatrox again the next morning, because his survival did not erase the limits of his body. Healing required time, care, and the ordinary work of another person. That dependence mattered. The aspect of war had treated mortal life as too weak for the task before it, yet a mortal household accomplished what celestial power could not. Iula gave Atreus a place in which survival could become more than one moment of refusal. During that recovery, Atreus reconsidered the direction in which he had looked for meaning. He had spent his life gazing toward the stars, seeking strength above the people and lands of Targon. The journey upward had cost Pylus his life and Atreus his freedom, while the path back to himself came through the care found below. The lesson did not make him hate all power without thought. It taught him to judge power by what it did to those who lacked it. Gods, aspects, ascended, and Darkin could describe their conflicts as matters of cosmic duty. Yet mortals lived with the villages destroyed, the homes abandoned, and the names that never returned. Atreus began to see mortality differently. A god might treat death as evidence of weakness, but mortals built lives while knowing loss could come. They planted crops, formed families, kept promises, and defended one another without the assurance that celestial power would preserve them. That knowledge did not make human effort pointless. It made every act of care more valuable. The realization separated Atreus from both warriors who had occupied the battlefield. Pantheon believed divine strength gave it the right to use a mortal body. Aatrox believed suffering allowed him to reduce mortal bodies to material for his return. Neither truly respected the people beneath their power. Atreus's anger grew from that shared contempt. The aspect and the Darkin appeared opposed, but both placed their grand purposes above the lives caught between them. One called itself war, the other pursued ruin. and ordinary people paid for each certainty. Trouble soon returned to the northern settlements of the Rakor. Barbarian invaders threatened homes that included Iula's farm, reviving the conflict that had helped drive Atreus and Pylus toward the summit. Atreus still needed months before he could lift a spear, but he decided that he would confront the danger himself. He carried the Aspect's weapons, although their former brilliance had dimmed. The spear and shield no longer made him an effortless celestial champion. They became reminders of what had been taken, and tools whose remaining power did not answer him automatically. This journey differed from his climb. Atreus no longer sought a god to solve the conflict, and he did not leave because he expected invulnerability. He went because people faced a threat, and he could still place himself between them and it. When he reached the fighting, the situation forced him to abandon one of his oldest assumptions. The barbarians he had considered enemies were themselves under attack. Their cries and fear revealed that they were not the source of the larger violence. Aatrox had driven them toward Targon. The Darkin stood behind the mortal conflict, turning one people against another and allowing fear to spread ahead of him. Atreus recognized that the Rakor and the barbarians occupied the same position in the struggle. Both were mortals suffering because a greater power treated their lives as pieces on a board. That recognition completed the change begun during his recovery. Atreus could have watched old enemies fall and called it justice. Instead, he stepped between them and Aatrox. He chose people before allegiance. The second clash belongs to Atreus rather than the celestial Pantheon. Aatrox recognized the battered spear and shield. To him, they belonged to the fallen Aspect, and the man carrying them looked like the remnant of a victory already won. Pantheon was gone, the constellation remained dark, and Atreus had no obvious claim to the power once used through his body. The Darkin mocked him. From Aatrox's view, Atreus represented the weakness celestial beings had always tried to cover with symbols and chosen vessels. The god had failed, so the mortal left behind could only be less. Atreus did not need to argue. He placed himself between Aatrox and people who could not match the Darkin's strength, accepting a contest that offered no assurance of victory. This was not the Aspect using a body to pursue its own war. It was a man making a choice. Aatrox's attacks forced Atreus down. Divine weapons did not prevent the difference in power from becoming clear, and courage did not turn the mortal into someone who could ignore every blow. Atreus fell to his knees. Once again, the fall was real. Around him, the people cried out. They were Rakor and barbarians, former enemies united by the simple fact that Aatrox threatened them all. Hearing them, Atreus found the reason to rise that the Aspect of war had never possessed. His will reignited the celestial spear. The power did not return because the original Pantheon reclaimed the body. That Aspect remained dead. It returned through Atreus, fueled by the mortal resolve the god had judged unworthy. Atreus leapt and struck Aatrox's sword arm, separating the Darkin from the limb that held his weapon. Aatrox and the blade fell. Atreus remained standing. Above them, the star bearing Atreus's name blazed again. The result is sometimes described as Atreus defeating Aatrox. And that description is true within the event we are given, but it needs careful meaning. Atreus did not permanently destroy the Darkin weapon. Aatrox's essence remained bound to the sword, and his larger threat to Runeterra did not end forever on that field. The victory mattered, because Atreus stopped him and saved the people in that moment. He broke Aatrox's advance, proved that the mortal dismissed by both God and Darkin could wield celestial power through his own will, and restored a star that had disappeared when the Aspect died. This was not a final ending. It was a refusal. For Aatrox, that refusal carried a meaning worse than an ordinary military defeat. He had already destroyed the aspect of war, one of the celestial forces connected to the order he hated. A mortal remnant should have confirmed his superiority. Instead, that mortal became the source of resistance the god could not provide. Atreus did not win by becoming less human. He won because he finally understood what being human required. The distinction reshapes the entire rivalry. Pantheon the Aspect entered battle because war belonged to its divine purpose. Atreus entered battle because frightened people stood behind him. Aatrox fought to impose his despair on the world. Atreus fought to keep open the possibility that people might live beyond that day. When the star returned, it no longer represented exactly what it had before. The old constellation had belonged to the celestial Pantheon, whose idea of strength excluded the man carrying it. The relit star answered Atreus instead. He chose to take the name Pantheon. By doing so, Atreus did not restore the god that controlled him. He reclaimed the symbol and remade it around mortality. War would no longer speak through a celestial being using a man. A man would carry the weapons of war while deciding where they should point. That choice turned a title of divine possession into a declaration of human agency. Atreus could have abandoned everything connected to the aspect, but leaving the weapons unused would not protect anyone from the next great power. He carried them without surrendering himself again. The new Pantheon vowed to oppose aspects, ascended beings, demons, and anyone whose power became so immense that it could only destroy. The list places Aatrox inside a much larger mission. Their rivalry remains personal, but Atreus's purpose cannot be reduced to revenge. Pylus remained gone. The aspect had taken part of Atreus's life, and Aatrox had left a lasting mark on his body and memory. None of those losses could be repaired by winning one battle. Atreus responded by defending the people still present. That is the foundation of his hope. It does not deny grief, and it does not promise that every person can be saved. It insists that loss does not have the right to decide every action that follows. From that point onward, Atreus represents everything Aatrox needs the world to reject. Aatrox and Atreus do not spend every part of their lives pursuing one another. Yet the force of their rivalry continues even when they occupy different lands. Each has become living evidence against the other's understanding of the world. Aatrox remembers a time when he stood among Shurima's greatest defenders. He faced the void, served an empire, and belonged to a brotherhood whose strength could decide the fate of civilizations. After that height came the empire's collapse, the corruption of the ascended, war among the Darkin, and confinement within a sword. His history appears to form a steady argument against hope. Service did not preserve Shurima. Victory against the void did not preserve the minds of those who returned. Immense strength did not protect the Darkin from celestial cunning. And ages of memory did not give Aatrox a path back to his original form. When Aatrox looks at ideals such as honor, loyalty, and protection, he sees promises that failed him. He once embodied those ideas and still ended inside a prison. From his perspective, a person who continues to believe after comparable loss must be ignorant, dishonest, or waiting to break. Atreus complicates that conclusion. He knows what it means to lose a homeland's defenders, a closest friend, control of his own body, and the divine certainty he climbed a mountain to claim. Aatrox cannot dismiss him as someone untouched by grief. The mortal still chooses hope. That hope is not cheerful optimism. Atreus does not believe the world will become safe if he offers a stirring speech. Nor does he expect every battle to end with the star above him blazing. His belief is narrower and tougher. He believes the next choice remains his even after the last choice ended in disaster. Aatrox tries to close that possibility. His world-ending goal would make every future choice meaningless, turning the suffering of his past into the final truth of all existence. Atreus protects the future precisely because it has not yet been decided. This difference explains why their power cannot be compared through size alone. Aatrox's strength grows from an ancient ascended form, rebuilt through blood magic and sustained through conquered bodies. Atreus channels the weapons of a fallen aspect through mortal will. One reaches backward, trying to reconstruct what was lost, while the other reaches forward without knowing what the next day will bring. Aatrox carries a sword larger than a mortal warrior could reasonably wield. The weapon is not simply equipment, because it is the prison containing his essence. Separating Aatrox from that blade interrupts the form he creates in the world, which is why Atreus's strike against the sword arm mattered so much. Atreus carries a spear and shield once belonging to the aspect of war. Unlike Aatrox, he is not sealed within either weapon. Their power can dim when his resolve fails, and return when he finds the will to act. His relationship with the weapons depends on agency rather than captivity. The shapes of their arsenals reflect their beliefs. Aatrox's blade turns every return into another version of his prison, even while it gives him power. Atreus's shield exists to stand between danger and another person, while his spear allows him to answer power without pretending defense alone will end every threat. Neither object determines the warrior completely. A sword can defend, and a shield can support conquest, yet the story deliberately places Aatrox behind an overwhelming blade, and Atreus behind a guard raised for mortals. Their silhouettes tell the same argument their histories develop. Aatrox also believes in hierarchy. His memories reach back to an age of god warriors, emperors, and armies, commanded by beings raised above ordinary humanity. Even after he rejects the authority of celestial forces, he continues to view the world through dominance. Bodies become resources, followers become tools, and strength becomes the right to impose meaning. Atreus began with a similar assumption in smaller form. He believed that power from the summit would allow him to decide what protection required. The aspect's possession forced him to experience the danger of that logic from below. Someone stronger considered his own will irrelevant. After surviving, Atreus refused to repeat that mistake. He did not save the barbarians because they had submitted to the Rakor or proved themselves useful. He protected them because their lives mattered before agreement. That choice may look simple, but it dismantles the hierarchy that both the aspect and the Darkin accepted. Atreus does not ask whether the frightened people behind him deserve a place in someone else's grand design. Their presence is enough. Aatrox's despair contains pride as well. He has suffered more than almost any mortal can understand. And that experience encourages him to treat his conclusion as uniquely informed. Anyone who still believes in meaning appears childish beside the ages he remembers. Atreus never claims to understand every century of Aatrox's confinement. He does something more threatening. He refuses to let the Darkin's suffering become permission to destroy everyone else. Compassion and surrender are not the same. Aatrox's past can explain the shape of his hatred without turning hatred into justice. Atreus can recognize that the Darkin was once a hero and still raise the shield when that former hero advances on the helpless. This balance keeps the rivalry from becoming a shallow contest between perfect good and effortless evil. Aatrox's fall matters because something worthy once existed within him. Atreus's rise matters because worthiness did not arrive as a permanent state protected from failure. One warrior treats his past greatness as evidence that the world owes him an ending. The other treats past defeat as preparation for another attempt. This brings me to the question at the center of most discussions about their rivalry, which is what victory truly meant. The first battle produces a clear result. Aatrox defeated the celestial Pantheon and destroyed the aspect within Atreus. The vanished constellation confirms that this was more than the death of an ordinary host. The second battle also produces a clear result. Atreus reignited the aspect spear, severed Aatrox from the arm holding his weapon, stopped the Darkin's attack, and remained standing while the star returned. Confusion begins when those results are stretched beyond what the story actually shows. Aatrox's first victory does not prove that Atreus can never oppose him, because Atreus later does exactly that. Atreus's second victory does not prove that Aatrox ceased to exist, because the Darkin remained bound to the blade. Their rivalry has no permanent final score. The circumstances of each battle also differ. The celestial Pantheon confronted Aatrox with full control of Atreus's body, believing divine strength would answer the threat. Aatrox's god-killing weapon overcame that power. During the later confrontation, Aatrox believed the fallen aspect's mortal vessel posed little danger. Atreus's power appeared only after he chose to stand for the people around him, and the sudden return of celestial force allowed him to break Aatrox's advance. Surprise contributed to the moment, yet describing the result as surprise alone misses the point. Atreus created that opening through a will neither opponent had respected. Aatrox misunderstood the mortal for the same reason Pantheon had misunderstood him, and the shared mistake became the source of both defeats. If they fought again, several facts would remain uncertain. Aatrox knows that Atreus can reignite the weapons, while Atreus knows the Darkin can destroy celestial power. Neither should approach a future battle with the same assumptions. The law does not provide a final, controlled contest in which both arrive fully prepared and fight until only one can ever return. Declaring an absolute answer would require inventing details the story has not given. What we can say is more interesting. Aatrox holds the greater history of supernatural warfare and has demonstrated enough force to kill the aspect of war. Atreus has demonstrated the exact quality needed to interrupt Aatrox when raw celestial confidence failed. Power in Runeterra does not operate like a single ladder. Celestial beings, ascended warriors, Darkin weapons, mortal hosts, and acts of will interact through rules that cannot always be reduced to one number. Context matters, weapons matter, purpose matters, and a single opening can change a battle. Atreus's victory remains impressive precisely because Aatrox was the more obvious power. If the mortal had secretly surpassed every god warrior in simple force, his stand would lose its central meaning. He entered a fight he had reason to fear and acted anyway. Aatrox's defeat remains temporary precisely because Atreus cannot solve the Darkin problem by winning one exchange. The sword survives, the prison endures, and another body can return Aatrox to the world. Hope must be practiced more than once, because despair does not disappear after a heroic moment. That ongoing nature makes them natural rivals. Atreus cannot point to the past and say the work is finished. Aatrox cannot point to one loss and accept that his view has been disproved. Each future crisis brings their argument back into the world. The title Pantheon makes the result even more layered. Aatrox killed Pantheon, and Atreus later became Pantheon. Both statements remain true because the name changed meaning between them. When Aatrox sees the new Pantheon, he sees proof that his greatest triumph did not erase what it was meant to erase. He tore the constellation of war from the sky, yet a mortal relit its star. The celestial being stayed gone, but its symbol returned under human control. Atreus does not undo Aatrox's victory. He builds something new from its aftermath. That distinction appears throughout his life. He cannot bring Pylus back, so he honors the value Pylus saw in him. He cannot recover the years the aspect controlled, so he uses the remaining weapons by his own choice. He cannot remove Aatrox's history, so he prevents that history from becoming everyone's fate. The rivalry continues through the choices each warrior makes after leaving that battlefield. After stopping Aatrox, Atreus did not settle into the life of a celebrated champion. Part of him continued to long for the ordinary existence represented by Eula's farm, where work followed seasons and value did not depend on cosmic conflict. That longing does not make his mission false. It reminds us that Atreus pays for the road he chooses. A god may embody war without needing a home away from it, while a mortal warrior can protect peace precisely because he understands what peace contains. A quiet meal, repaired tools, planted fields, and familiar voices matter in this story. They provide the answer to Aatrox's belief that only grand power survives history. Civilizations are not held together only by emperors and ascended champions. They also endure through ordinary labor repeated after catastrophe. Eula represents that labor more clearly than any celestial figure. She survives Pylus, tends the homestead, cares for Atreus, and refuses to treat either grief or heroism as an excuse to abandon life. Her strength does not ignite a constellation, but it helps the man who does. Aatrox would see a farm as fragile. Weather, invasion, or a passing army could destroy it more easily than they could damage a celestial monument. Atreus sees fragility and understands why it deserves defense. This is the quietest division between them. Aatrox values what can overpower the world. Atreus learns to value what the world can easily lose. The difference also affects how each remembers fallen companions. Aatrox's lost brethren feed his rage against the order that confined them, while he calls to other Darkin from a position shaped by vengeance and command. Shared suffering becomes another army. Atreus carries Pylus's memory without turning Pylus into a demand for endless retaliation. His friend's death influences every stage of the story, yet Atreus does not pretend that more dead mortals could balance the mountain's cost. Protecting Eula honors Pylus more than conquering in his name ever could. That idea may be the strongest answer to Aatrox's past. The Darkin cannot restore the Ascended who once defended Shurima, and destruction will not recreate the brotherhood he remembers. Atreus also cannot restore his friend, but he can protect the life his friend loved. Memory can become an obligation to preserve, not only a reason to punish. Aatrox has not accepted that path. His pain remains fixed on what was taken from him, and every new body becomes another failed attempt to close the distance between present and past. He does not build a future in which the old Aatrox could be honored. He tries to make the world share his ruin. Atreus refuses the invitation. The ruination later gives Atreus a different kind of defeat, one he cannot answer with the spear alone. Atreus' stand against Aatrox did not make his will permanently unbreakable. That later truth is necessary, because a hero who can never again fail would begin to resemble the flawless divine ideal he rejected. During the return of Viego and the spread of the Black Mist, Atreus faced another power capable of reaching into identity and desire. The force of the ruination overcame him, and the aspect of war stirred again through his body. Atreus lost control. This event reopened the oldest wound in his story. He had once been forced into the far corner of his own mind, while Pantheon used his body. After reclaiming his name and proving that mortal will could fuel the celestial weapons, he found himself dominated again. The defeat harmed more than his confidence in battle. It threatened the belief on which he had rebuilt his identity. If his will could fail, perhaps every claim he made about human resilience had been nothing more than pride. Once the ruination ended, Atreus returned to Eula's homestead in a state far removed from the warrior who had stopped Aatrox. He no longer carried defeat as something external. He treated it as evidence against himself. The official story of this period places him in ordinary surroundings, where his divine weapons cannot solve what troubles him. He attempts simple work, including baking bread, and discovers that strength with a spear does not make him skilled at every task. The scene adds warmth, but it also serves a serious purpose. Atreus had made war the language through which he proved his value. Back at the farm, he could not answer shame by finding a greater opponent. Iula refused to worship him and refused to let him disappear into self-condemnation. She had already lived through Pylos' absence and Atreus' long departures. Her response came from a mortal understanding of grief that did not require celestial explanations. Atreus believed he had betrayed his own ideal because he fell. Iula reminded him, through action and blunt honesty, that falling had always been part of his life. His worth never came from avoiding the ground. That changed the problem. The ruination had defeated him, but shame tried to make the defeat permanent. Viego's power no longer controlled his body, yet Atreus continued giving the event authority over every choice afterward. Recovery required him to apply his philosophy inward. It had been easier to tell frightened strangers that mortal life deserved protection than to believe a failed protector still deserved a place among other people. Atreus had to rise without pretending the ruination never happened. This period brings him closer to Aatrox than the second Darkin battle ever could. Both warriors experienced the loss of control over their own existence. Both emerged carrying humiliation and anger. Both could look at the past and decide that nothing ahead deserved trust. Atreus chose differently again, although the choice came slowly. He allowed another person to challenge the story he told about his failure, and he returned to work that did not offer immediate glory. Aatrox isolates himself inside certainty. He knows what the world means, he knows how it must end, and anyone who resists simply has not suffered enough to understand. Atreus accepts correction from Iula. That humility protects him from becoming another version of the Darkin. The lesson also refines the meaning of his title. The new Pantheon is not unbreakable because no force can bend him. He is unbreakable because breaking does not remove the possibility of repair. Those are different promises. The first belongs to a statue, flawless until the instant it cracks. The second belongs to a living person, altered by every fall but still capable of movement. Aatrox remains trapped by the first idea. He remembers himself as a noble ascended and cannot accept any future that does not restore that perfect image or end the world that denied it. Atreus abandons the need to return unchanged. The scar, the lost years, the ruination, and the failures remain part of him. He rises as someone who carries them, not someone who erased them. Eventually, the call leads Atreus back toward Targon, and the place where his identity first disappeared. Atreus' story later returns to Mount Targon, the place where his search for divine power began. The return carries a different purpose, because he no longer approaches the mountain as a supplicant, asking the heavens to make him worthy. Conflict meets him on the slopes, including Leona, the aspect of the sun, and a leader tied to the Solari. Atreus once resented the restraint of Solari authority, then learned to distrust the destructive distance of divine power. Standing against Leona brings those stages of his life together. Their confrontation does not end with a simple personal victory. Celestial force descends from above, and Atreus is driven from the mountain. For a moment, the fall appears to repeat everything that came before. He descends through the sky with the weapons dark. The important movement begins below him. Atreus sees the world beneath the mountain, the land where ordinary lives continue far from celestial judgment. His purpose returns, and the spear and shield ignite. Instead of falling away from Targon, he turns upward. The image completes the reversal begun after Aatrox killed the aspect. Atreus first climbed Mount Targon because he wanted the stars to give him power. Now the power answers when he looks toward the people below, and he carries that mortal purpose back toward the stars. He does not rise to become less human. He rises because humanity remains worth defending from forces above it. The moment should not be treated as proof that Atreus has become an untouchable god. His power has always depended on will, and will can weaken, recover, or change direction. The ruination already established that no awakening removes the possibility of another defeat. What the return proves is simpler. Atreus can find his way back after losing the certainty that once fueled him. Hope can survive doubt without remaining bright every hour. Aatrox would interpret a dimmed weapon as evidence that resistance eventually fails. Atreus treats dimness as a condition that can change. That may be why the two warriors continue to mirror one another so well. Aatrox's body must be rebuilt again and again, but his belief never changes. Atreus's body remains his own, while his belief repeatedly breaks and reforms. One repeats a form, the other renews a choice. Their stories also offer three different meanings for war. The celestial Pantheon embodied war as an abstract force. It valued the scale and purpose of conflict more than the mortal mind carrying its weapons. In that form, war stood above humanity and used humanity. Aatrox had once been a warrior in service to Shurima, but the Darkin Age allowed war to swallow every earlier purpose. Battles stopped being the means of defending a world and became instruments of domination, vengeance, and ruin. Atreus offers a third meaning. For him, battle has no value by itself. Its meaning depends on who stands behind the shield and what life becomes possible when the spear is lowered. This does not turn him into a pacifist. Atreus remains a warrior, and his answer to destructive power often requires direct confrontation. He simply refuses to worship conflict. That refusal separates him from the aspect whose title he carries. The old Pantheon could see war as its natural domain. Atreus sees war as a burden mortals sometimes accept, because surrender would leave others exposed. Aatrox understands battle as proof of strength. A victory confirms his dominance, while every defeated opponent becomes material for the form he tries to sustain. Even his physical existence relies on treating bodies as resources of war. Atreus understands battle as service. A victory matters because someone else receives another morning. His own survival matters, but it is not the only measure. This distinction explains why the armies below the first Aatrox battle are so important. To both ancient combatants, those armies appeared beneath the true confrontation. To Atreus, once awake, the people below became the true reason to confront powers above. Scale does not determine importance. A single homestead can matter more than an aspect's pride. A widow's judgment can guide a celestial weapon more wisely than the constellation that created it. A group of frightened former enemies can give a warrior a better purpose than an empire. The rivalry repeatedly reverses expected scale in this way. Aatrox's story crosses millennia, while Atreus's decisive choices occur in moments. Aatrox remembers a vast empire, while Atreus protects particular people. Aatrox tries to reshape existence, while Atreus focuses on the next act. The smaller choice wins no permanent cosmic peace, yet it keeps the larger destruction from becoming complete. Atreus's version of hope never depends on certainty. Hope is often presented as confidence that events will improve. Atreus represents something less comfortable. He acts without knowing that improvement will follow. When he climbed Targon, he expected power and received possession. When he returned to fight Aatrox, he could not know the spear would ignite. When he stood after the ruination, he could not know whether his confidence would return. The choices matter because the outcomes were uncertain. Aatrox seeks a final answer. He wants the world to confirm that his suffering has only one conclusion, and his destructive campaign attempts to remove every competing possibility. Nothing would remain to surprise him, disappoint him, or prove him wrong. Atreus accepts an unfinished world. People may fail, institutions may betray their purpose, and divine power may create new danger. None of that prevents the next person from choosing differently. This acceptance demands more courage than certainty. Aatrox's belief protects him from vulnerability by treating every hopeful act as foolish before it begins. Atreus remains open to disappointment because closing that door would also close the future. His relationship with Eula shows what this looks like away from battle. Atreus cannot guarantee he will always return to the farm, and Eula cannot guarantee that hard work will protect the homestead from every threat. They continue caring for what exists anyway. That ordinary persistence gives the rivalry emotional weight. If hope meant only celestial fire, most people in Runeterra could do nothing but wait for a chosen champion. Atreus learns hope from people who never touched the summit. Pylus showed it by turning rivalry into brotherhood. Eula showed it by building a life after grief and caring for the man who returned. The Rakor and the barbarians showed it when their cries gave Atreus a reason to stand between them and Aatrox. Atreus does not create hope alone. He carries what others kindle. Aatrox also depends on others, but he refuses to describe the relationship that way. His body requires hosts, his campaigns require victims and followers, and his identity remains tied to brethren from Shurima's past. He treats dependence as domination because admitting need would challenge the image of absolute power. Atreus can admit need. He needed Pylus beside him, Eula's care, the cries of the people, and reminders after the ruination. His strength becomes larger when it includes those connections. For Aatrox, another person is something to control or overcome. For Atreus, another person can become the reason control should be resisted. Aatrox remains tragic without becoming innocent. Calling Aatrox tragic does not excuse his actions. It recognizes the distance between the defender he once represented and the destroyer he became. The earlier Aatrox earned honor through service. He fought the void when Runeterra faced a threat capable of consuming everything he knew. His courage helped preserve a world that later became the target of his rage. That reversal gives every encounter with him an echo of wasted possibility. The strength threatening mortals once protected their ancestors. The commander gathering destruction once united god warriors. The weapon imprisoning him once belonged to a champion who carried it freely. Aatrox cannot see a path from his present self toward a meaningful future. His identity remains divided between memory and imitation. He remembers the noble form he possessed, while every body he builds reminds him that he cannot return to it. Destruction becomes attractive because creation would force him to accept limits. Building anything new would mean living as the being he is now, not recovering the one he remembers. A future requires compromise with reality. Aatrox refuses that compromise. Atreus faces a smaller version of the same temptation after the aspect dies. He cannot return to the recruit who trained beside Pylus, because the mountain changed him and Pylus is gone. He cannot become the celestial Pantheon, because the aspect died and its domination was never a life he wanted. He builds a third identity. The new Pantheon contains the Rakor recruit, the unwilling host, the survivor, and the defender carrying celestial weapons. It does not restore any earlier stage perfectly. Atreus accepts a self-assembled from everything that happened. Aatrox tries to assemble a body while rejecting the self created by his history. That is why the form never satisfies him. The contrast suggests a path the Darkin cannot yet take. Meaning, after catastrophe, may require mourning what cannot return, accepting help, and building an identity that does not depend on restoring the past. Atreus demonstrates each step through action. Aatrox sees such acceptance as humiliation. To him, anything less than his former glory confirms defeat. Atreus learns that admitting defeat can be the beginning of another choice. This is why pity alone cannot stop the Darkin. Aatrox's tragedy has become an active threat to everyone around him, and understanding the origin of his despair does not protect a village from his advance. The shield still has to rise. Atreus can hold both truths. Aatrox was wronged by an imprisonment few minds could endure, and Aatrox is wrong to make all life answer for it. The future of their rivalry remains open because neither warrior has received a permanent ending. Aatrox remains a danger because his weapon has not been destroyed and his essence remains bound within it. Removing him from one body interrupts his return. But it does not resolve the prison that created the Darkin Blade's present existence. Atreus remains active as the new Pantheon, opposing forces that place overwhelming power above mortal life. His mission reaches beyond Aatrox to aspects, ascended beings, demons, and any comparable threat. Their next meeting has not been fully told. That absence leaves several important possibilities open without confirming any of them. Aatrox could approach Atreus with greater caution, knowing the mortal can ignite the fallen aspect's weapons. Atreus could face doubt again, because his power does not remain separated from his state of will. The Darkin could return through another host, and the context of a new battle could differ completely from the field near Targon. What cannot return is the ignorance of their earlier encounters. Aatrox knows that the man inside the aspect was not irrelevant. Atreus knows that divine power alone offers no assurance against the Darkin's blade. They have become personal symbols to one another. Aatrox represents the scale of power Atreus vowed to oppose, and Atreus represents the mortal refusal Aatrox's worldview cannot easily explain. That makes a future clash more than a rematch. Each warrior would enter knowing that the opponent once broke what appeared unbreakable. Aatrox broke war in the heavens. Atreus broke the certainty of Aatrox's victory. Neither act completed the story. The constellation returned in a new form, and the Darkin survived within the sword. Their unfinished states preserve the rivalry. The final outcome may depend on matters larger than combat. Aatrox has yet to accept a future that neither restores the past nor erases the present, while Atreus must continue choosing mortal purpose whenever divine power, shame, or exhaustion pulls him away from it. The lore answers only the second question so far, and even that answer must be renewed. Atreus has returned more than once, but no return guarantees the next. That is not a weakness in the story. It is the point. Their unfinished conflict also prevents either character from becoming a fixed lesson carved in stone. Aatrox could still make another choice, although the known story gives no sign that he has abandoned destruction. Atreus could fail again, although every earlier return shows that failure does not have to become his final identity. The lack of certainty keeps responsibility with them. A prophecy cannot excuse Aatrox by declaring his fall inevitable, and destiny cannot carry Atreus each time his will grows tired. History influences them, power enlarges the effects of their choices, and other people help shape the path, but neither warrior becomes a machine following one unavoidable command. That freedom is uncomfortable because it leaves the future exposed. It is also the only condition in which hope has meaning. If Atreus were guaranteed to rise, his courage would become routine. If Aatrox were incapable of anything except destruction, the tragedy of his earlier nobility would lose much of its force. Runeterra waits between those possibilities. The sword can find another bearer, the spear can darken, and the star can blaze again. No single image closes the argument. Atreus proves several things through the life he has lived. Atreus proves that weakness and worth are not opposites. He lacked the natural excellence expected of a great Rakor warrior, and the aspect used those defeats as evidence that he did not deserve control of his own body. The same defeats taught him how to rise. He proves that mortal limits can create responsibility. Knowing that a life can end does not make it insignificant. It makes the choice to defend that life immediate. He proves that symbols can be reclaimed. Pantheon once named a celestial force that erased him, but Atreus took the title and changed what it served. He proves that victory can remain meaningful without becoming permanent. Stopping Aatrox once did not remove every Darkin threat, yet the people behind Atreus survived that encounter. He proves that failure after victory does not reveal the victory as false. The ruination overcame him later, but it did not erase the choice he made against Aatrox, nor did it remove the possibility of rising again. Most of all, Atreus proves that hope does not require innocence. He understands betrayal, grief, possession, and defeat. He does not protect the world because he has avoided its cruelty. He protects it because people still live within it. Aatrox provides a warning shaped by the life he abandoned. Aatrox shows how a protector can begin treating pain as authority. His suffering becomes the reason no one else's future matters, and his memory of service becomes the foundation for contempt rather than care. He shows the danger of refusing every identity except a lost one. Because he cannot become the noble ascended exactly as he remembers himself, he regards every present form as an insult. He shows how power can hide dependence. Aatrox appears overwhelming, yet he relies on the sword, stolen bodies, and the continued existence of people he claims to despise. He shows that surviving a great enemy does not guarantee surviving what follows. The Ascended defeated the Void's immediate advance, but many could not find peace after the war or unity after Shurima's collapse. He also warns against simple judgment, calling him a monster and refusing to remember the defender he once was makes it easier to miss how such a fall occurs. Honor without healing, power without purpose, and memory without acceptance can all turn inward. None of that makes his campaign less dangerous. Aatrox remains responsible for what he chooses to do with pain. The story never asks mortals to submit because his suffering is ancient. It places Atreus in his path. This is why the rivalry matters beyond the result of either battle. Runeterra contains rivalries built on kingdoms, bloodlines, betrayal, and competing visions of magic. Aatrox and Pantheon stand apart because their conflict asks what gives a person the right to hope after history has provided reasons not to. Aatrox carries the stronger argument from scale. He can point to the Void War, the fall of Shurima, the Darkin Wars, celestial betrayal, and centuries of imprisonment. His evidence stretches across ages. Atreus answers with one act at a time. He stands after Aatrox leaves him. He accepts Ayula's care. He walks toward the threatened settlements. He protects former enemies. He raises a dimmed spear. He returns after the ruination. He turns upward when the mountain casts him down. None of those acts disproves every tragedy Aatrox remembers. Together, they disprove the claim that tragedy controls every future choice. That is enough to make Atreus dangerous to him. The rivalry also gives both characters something they lack alone. Without Atreus, Aatrox's despair can become so vast that ordinary people seem irrelevant. Atreus forces the story to measure world-ending power against one mortal decision. Without Aatrox, Atreus' persistence can sound like a simple lesson about trying again. Aatrox tests that belief against an opponent whose pain, history, and strength make hope genuinely difficult. Their confrontation earns its meaning because neither side is small. Aatrox's suffering is not shallow, and Atreus' hope is not easy. The shield meets the sword between those truths. At the end of their known story, every part returns to the same contrast. This has been the story of Aatrox and Pantheon, a fallen defender who tries to make despair the final law of the world, and a mortal who refuses to surrender the future. Their rivalry began before they knew one another, in the opposite paths of an ascended warrior descending from glory and a Rakoran recruit climbing from repeated defeat. Aatrox once protected Runeterra from the void. Shurima's collapse and the Darkin Wars stripped away the order that gave his power meaning, while celestial sorcery imprisoned him within his sword. When he returned through stolen bodies, the form he created could imitate his old greatness without restoring it. Atreus began without greatness. He trained, lost, rose, and formed a brotherhood with Pylus. Their climb toward Targon ended with Pylus gone, and Atreus possessed by the aspect of war, the very power he believed would let him protect his people. Pantheon judged Atreus unworthy and took his body. Aatrox killed that divine Pantheon and darkened the constellation of war. The god fell, yet the man stood hours later. At Iula's farm, Atreus learned to look below the stars. Mortal life appeared fragile, temporary, and full of grief. But those limits did not make it lesser. They gave every act of protection a reason. When Aatrox threatened the barbarians he had driven toward Targon, Atreus stepped between the Darkin and people he once considered enemies. Aatrox forced him down, the cries behind him restored his purpose, and mortal will relit the celestial spear. Atreus stopped Aatrox without permanently ending him. The result preserved the central truth of both characters. Despair can return, and hope must rise more than once. Later defeat during the Ruination did not spare Atreus from doubt. He lost control again, and returned to Iula convinced that failure had exposed him. The recovery that followed reminded him that unbreakable does not mean untouched. It means capable of repair. Aatrox cannot accept repair because repair produces something changed. He wants the lost ascended form, the lost brotherhood, and the lost meaning of his past restored without compromise. Or he wants the world that denied them brought to ruin. Atreus accepts change. The new Pantheon is not the recruit who climbed, not the aspect that possessed him, and not an untouched hero above mortal weakness. He is the person created by every defeat and every decision that followed. That is why their rivalry cannot be settled only by asking who has more power. Aatrox has already shown enough power to destroy war in the heavens. Atreus has shown that even after war dies, a man can choose to stand. The first Pantheon fought because it was the aspect of war. Atreus fights because someone has to protect the people beneath the battle. Aatrox looks at endless suffering and decides that hope must be false. Atreus looks at limited life and decides that hope must be chosen. Neither warrior has reached a final ending. Aatrox remains within the Darkin Blade, capable of returning when another body gives him passage into the world. Atreus continues to carry the fallen aspect's spear and shield, their light answering a will that has failed before and can still rise again. Their next battle may not repeat the last. Aatrox will not mistake Atreus for an irrelevant remnant so easily, and Atreus cannot assume that courage alone guarantees the same opening. The uncertainty keeps the future honest. Atreus does not need a guarantee. He never did. Long before celestial fire answered him, before his name burned among the stars, his defining act remained the same. He fell, accepted that the fall had happened, and placed his hands against the ground. Then he stood,